Hey everybody, it's Erik Torenberg, co-founder, partner of Village Global, a network-driven venture firm. And this is Venture Stories, a podcast covering topics relating to tech and business with world-leading experts. Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Venture Stories by Village Global. I'm here today with a very special guest, Joel Monegro of Placeholder. Joel, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Erik.
So, Joel, I'm excited to start by getting into the Placeholder thesis that you wrote a few years ago. But and you start with sort of this backdrop, sort of setting the historical context for why you're so excited about crypto. And one of the things you talk about is how each new technological revolution creates new business models that commoditize the old, or creates new technologies that commoditize the old business models. So I'm curious if you can get into that. But also, I'm curious, are there sort of natural laws around the evolution of centralizing and decentralizing technologies or business models over time? It's my understanding that up until very recently, most technologies have only led to increasing centralization. I just read The Sovereign Individual, and it says that, or predicted in 1990s, that only now we are starting, that trend is starting to be reversed. And so I'm curious how you see sort of the evolution between centralization and decentralization over time as it relates to technology. And if it is being reversed, why now? What would lead to that?
Sure. So starting with a bit of the history, it's really a history of information technology as its own technological revolution, and then the different cycles that we've seen within information technology. If we consider the industry being born in, say, the early 1950s, when the transistor came along and we started building these information systems, or more, what we think of the earlier computers. If you set that as the start, we've kind of gone through a few kind of major cycles. First, what I like to call the hardware era was that period in time that started with the commercialization of the microprocessor, the transistor, in the 50s and 60s. And that was a wave that IBM rode to the top to become the world's largest computer company. What transistors did is they completely collapsed the cost of building electronics. So electronics had been existing for a while, electricity existed for a while, and we had already figured out that we could use it to build information systems and communication systems. Things like the telegraph and the telephone and things like that operated with some of these technologies. But before the transistor, we had to build these machines with they were vacuum tubes at the time to kind of move information and electricity in various ways that were very fragile and very expensive. And the transistor came along as a kind of openly available commodity technology that everyone had access to. And all of a sudden, building electronic chips became really, really cheap. We got the consumer electronics boom, microwaves, fridges, all of that stuff. Then we also got computers, or the early mainframes, riding off of that technology. And so we got the emergence of a new industry, the computer industry at scale. And so we had a period of innovation in the 50s where a bunch of large companies and startups kind of got into the computer game. And as I mentioned, IBM stood out and became the giant of that industry. Towards the end of the 60s, the concern that IBM was too big and definitely a giant, they used to call it Big Blue, was now part of society, very much in the same way that we're now concerned about Facebook and Google and so on. So IBM had risen to dominance, and now the public sentiment had turned against it, and that gets reflected in the press and gets reflected in government action. So there was a famous lawsuit that lasted 13 years, which was the U.S. versus IBM lawsuit that started, I want to say, in 1969, thereabouts. But it wasn't until the microprocessor came along in 1971 that IBM's market power started to dwindle. So what happened in 1971 is Intel created the microprocessor, and the microprocessor did essentially the same thing that transistors had done 2 decades before, where IBM's business model was based on proprietary hardware, where they had built their own platforms and systems and had iterated on them. We went through a series of kind of the IBM platforms that were very consolidated, and IBM provided the entire suite of services. It was the hardware, the software, the integration. These were big machines, and IBM kind of did that all custom for you if you were a bank or a government or a university or so on. And the microprocessor came along and switched from special purpose computing to general purpose computing in a way. And from the microprocessor, we got the PC standard. And so what the microprocessor did was introduce a new standard, a new open standard that allowed people to build computers for much cheaper. And that is what ended up commoditizing IBM's business model, because we went from essentially one large computer manufacturer. There was a joke that it was IBM and the seven dwarfs, because it was larger than the seven largest than the seven next largest competitors combined, to having dozens or hundreds of PC manufacturers over the decades that followed the microprocessor. And then as a result of that, we also got the software industry now on top of this new PC ecosystem. We got a new cycle on top, because what happened is that the hardware business commoditized because of the microprocessor, but then all the value moved to the software business, the stuff on top. And then we got a similar kind of progression where Microsoft started out as a startup with a bunch of other independent software vendors and people trying to build operating systems. Microsoft became the winner, and their business model was based on proprietary software and proprietary distribution. So they had contracts with PC manufacturers to distribute the OS, and with retail stores and so on. And similar story happened where Microsoft grew to dominance, had this proprietary business model, and it wasn't until the web and Linux came along in 1991 that a new open standard or platform became available for people to build upon, that directly challenged Microsoft's business model of proprietary hardware and distribution. Now we had free software and free distribution via the internet. So we saw kind of a similar type of progression and dynamic, and we're seeing it today now, another 20 years later, with the Googles and the Facebooks, because the web and Linux came along, provided a new platform that challenged Microsoft's business model. Then the value moved again one layer up to the networks and the data, which is what makes Google, Facebook, and so on valuable. And now we're at that stage where they've gotten too big. Public sentiment is turning against it, and we're seeing it in the media, and we're seeing it in the way governments are reacting to these platforms. And then again, right around this time, we're seeing now new platforms, new standards, and what we're seeing in crypto emerge in a way as a response to the consolidation and the centralization that's happening on the web.
Yeah, and I'm curious, and I'll give some examples of where if there was like a natural law around centralization or versus decentralization over time would be helpful. For example, over time, will we all be speaking English, or will there sort of be thousands of languages that will continue to fragment, or one currency, or thousands of currencies?
Right.
Or because I just read The Sovereign Individual, will we have thousands of Singapores and Hong Kongs and Israel, or one big global? Do we coalesce? How do you, and what determines that?
Yeah, that's a fascinating question, because there's so many ways to look at it. I'll start with one and then go to the others. When it comes to investing in business, I like to look at the problem through the eyes of markets. And what I see is that when there is consolidation in a market or concentration as a result of scale of any winner who achieves economies of scale faster than the others, or similar, is that all of a sudden it becomes really expensive to compete. Innovation becomes expensive, in the sense that if it's the 1960s and you're trying to start a computer business, forget it. There's no way you can compete with IBM. And if it's the 80s or the 90s and you're trying to start an operating system business, forget it. You're not going to win against Microsoft. And so the cost of innovation increases in the current market structure, but the demand for innovation, or I don't know what we should call it, but the pace of innovation, the desire, the drive for innovation, the force of innovation does not stop. And what ends up happening is it gets funneled to places where there aren't any incumbents, or there isn't a force that prevents you from growing and establishing a position. And so it's almost as if entrepreneurs end up moving to the new platforms where they can actually innovate, and they can innovate for cheaper rather than try and build under the current paradigms. So the way that's happening on the web now is it's really expensive to try and compete with Google or Facebook in consumer services. And that gets reflected in the amounts of money that a startup has to raise on the web today to even get started is completely absurd. And that shows up, in the cost of talent. That shows up in a bunch of different ways. And that ends up coming back down to us, the investors, because it ends up changing the economics in the sense that, but if I'm investing on the web, I have to put a lot more money to work to have a decent chance at success. And even then, it's far from guaranteed. And we've kind of seen how VC has transformed over the last 10 years to levels that kind of feel unreasonable. But over here in crypto, we see a lot more space for opportunity and growth, and entrepreneurs are doing the same. So they're moving to the new platform. So from the point of view of business, I think that's what drives these cycles of expansion and consolidation. When there's too much consolidation in a market, all the value is concentrated in the incumbents, and then all the startups and all the entrepreneurs and their investors can't create any value there. And so investment activity and innovation activity moves to more open fields. So that's how I think about the markets. As far as society is concerned, we can open the kind of philosophy books here on centralization, because you could say the world is getting more centralized, but you could also say that it's getting more decentralized, and this is where it gets kind of fuzzy and relative and subjective. But the English example is kind of a brilliant one, because I don't think centralization is bad in and of itself. There's a lot of benefits to centralization. It's actually very useful for Google to be quite centralized, because all of their services work very well together. It's kind of seamless, and it increases the value to consumers. And so that's why, calls to break up the tech giants are kind of a little difficult, because you break them up, you're going to make it harder for consumers. What's problematic is ownership and control of ownership. And so maybe one way to think about it is functional centralization is desirable in the way that, for example, all of us speaking English is a kind of functional centralization that's desirable because it increases the efficiency of our transactions and communications. What's undesirable is centralized control of resources. And I think that's really what is driving discomfort. And it's not so much that we don't want these services to exist, is that it makes us uncomfortable that they're owned by one company that is controlled by a relatively small group of people, and so on. And so what I think we're doing with crypto is kind of not mirroring, but kind of playing with those ideas where we get to have these decentralized networks that are functionally centralized in the sense that they provide you these discrete specific services, but they are in terms of how they're organized, they're more decentralized. So there's less of that element of centralized control.
Totally. And so if you had to make a prediction for how it would happen with languages, for example, how do you think we should think about that?
I think a single language is ideal. And, I'm pausing because I'm Dominican. My primary language is Spanish. I grew up in a few places and ended up learning a few languages. And English is by far the most useful language in the world, perhaps followed by Spanish. But it is incredible how much of a leg up you get in life when you know English. And I say this coming from a country where it's a very poor country, and something that actually delineates a lot of social lines or class lines in societies like that ends up being language. And so that is, if we talk about language specifically, centralization in language is a very desirable thing in my eyes. There's a very clear divide in terms of the scale of the opportunities that you can access when you speak English, for example. And I'll just focus on English because it's even the kind of thing where the number of Wikipedia articles in English are orders of magnitude larger than the ones in other languages. And so if you just use that as a metric, just the volume of information that's unavailable to you if you don't speak the most common language I'll just go with big.
Yeah. And how about, currencies or maybe even just crypto in specific? How should we think about, what should be centralized versus what shouldn't be, centralized? should there be centralized applications on top of decentralized protocols, or what's the obviously lots of currencies I guess you'd prefer, although I'm not sure. How do you think about it?
Well, in terms of the applications, I think you can have all the combinations, and they work for different purposes. So I came up with this quadrant that kind of, when it comes to the architecture of applications and systems, you can think of I think the x-axis goes from centralized production to decentralized production, and the y-axis goes from non-custodial data to custodial data models. And I put the web in the centralized and custodial quadrant. So that's what you would think as a completely centralized application. And I put crypto on the opposite end of the spectrum, or full crypto on the opposite end of the spectrum, being decentralized in production and non-custodial data models. So these are the most lightweight systems. But then you also have the other two quadrants. You can have applications that are centrally produced but non-custodial. So, for example, if you think of USDC, which is Coinbase's and Circle's fiat-backed stablecoin, it's a centralized service, but it has these kind of non-custodial crypto elements to it. And so that is what I kind of think of as a centralized non-custodial service. And then you can potentially also have decentralized and custodial services, which in that I actually don't know how that would work. So I haven't explored that idea too deeply. But in terms of when you would want one versus the other, I think it varies a lot by market. But the heuristic I like to use is that the more important it is for a system to be self-sovereign and independent from any outside influence, the more you want to be in the decentralized, non-custodial realm. But there are certain applications that certainly benefit from other combinations. Now, when it comes to currencies and tokens, that I don't have a strong opinion on. There's one side of me that goes, well, it's okay to have, there's many reasons why you would want to have many competitive instruments. In one way in which we may be able to solve the kind of coordination issues is through either highly efficient markets where you can use your currency, I can use mine, and if we have efficient exchange mechanisms that can manage those interfaces very efficiently, it may not matter. And that is a potential future where you kind of use you hold the assets that you want, and when it comes to engaging in a transaction, the systems in the background make sure that you get the currency that you want, and I spend the currency that I want. And that's kind of what we have already with credit cards and debit cards. If you think about it, when you travel abroad and swipe your credit card, a bunch of systems in the background are making those transactions for you so that you don't have to think about it. So we may end up in a similar place with crypto. But ultimately, I think currencies are a really small part of what crypto is. Even store value is, I think, a really small or a relatively small part of what crypto is. I'm more interested in what other kinds of things we can do with tokens that go beyond payments.
Yeah, I'm excited to get into that. But to ask one more on the decentralization, you mentioned in an interview over a year ago with Laura Shin that the idealist in you believes that we'll have a larger number of networks than people expect over time. Do you still believe that, or is that still the idealist position?
I still believe that, and it's still idealist, which means I'm still an idealist, which is good. It can be bad sometimes, but where I would say the nuance is what is a network in this case, and if it's raw blockchain, if we want to get technical and talk about raw blockchains or layer 0, layer 1, whatever your favorite term is, then I don't think we will end up with I think we end up with 4 to 6 large networks that everything that we have multiple networks on top of. And so it's, to me, when I say network in that context, I'm referring less to say blockchains or ledgers, and more to or I'm thinking more broadly, including things like a DAO is a network, for example, right? And so there can be lots of tiny little DAOs, and I think of all of those as networks.
You've made some comparison between crypto networks and governments or countries. what do you think? What's the best way to think about that?
Yeah. So this analogy came up a few years ago. It started out with realizing that the core developers of a crypto network or of a sovereign crypto network are kind of like the executive branch of a national government, where they write the code and they kind of execute the things and make proposals and all of that, but they can't force the network to adopt the changes that they want necessarily. They have to go through a governance process to do that. That involves getting the other constituents on board, or getting the constituents of the network on board, and starting to see how that ended up feeling a little bit like a Congress or a parliament, where you can have the executive branch kind of on the day-to-day making things work. But when it comes to making significant changes to the protocol, say amending the constitution, that has to go through a separate process. And that kind of started unraveling in different ways. The idea that the core development team as the executive branch, then you have the users as the kind of constituent citizens. But then, especially when you get into proof of stake systems, then you have these kind of representative systems. But generally, the notion that a crypto network is managed a lot more like a community and a country than a company, where in a company you have kind of like a military structure, right? You have the chief executive, and you have the lieutenants, and you have the it's very much a pyramid or a hierarchy in that sense. But a country is a lot messier. There's a lot more diplomacy involved. There's a lot more politics involved, and we see those things playing out in crypto, where it's not one person's decision to make a change. You have to bring people into the decisions, and that ends up being a political and diplomatic process.
Yeah, and to go on a bit of a tangent here, how do you think crypto will interface with actual governments? We've seen China make blockchain a priority. How will that play out? How should that play out? It seems that it will only be messy at some point. How do you foresee that playing out?
So I can tell you what my idealist wants to see, and
give us both.
What my idealist wants to see is governments focus on the interface between their sovereignty and the network's sovereignty, which to me is the point of the fiat exchange point. And so the way I think of it, a crypto network should be sovereign, but governments should have and do have the authority to govern local usage of the network, but not the network itself. And it's very much like the internet, right? The internet exists as an entity unto itself in a way, but governments individually regulate their own local usage, and some do it for the good of the people, and some do it for other purposes. And so, we see governments engage in censorship and things like that, or weaponizing the internet, and obviously those are things that we do not want. But ultimately, under the current power structures, it is in their power to do that. I think the relationship with crypto networks should be the same. Any individual government should not be able to have, the power to say shut down a network, but it should have the power to regulate local usage. And I think the only point where it makes sense for them to do that is the point of fiat exchange. And that's actually where I think a progressive government will have an opportunity to set themselves up to capitalize on crypto as a society, because that ends up being the point of most friction. And it's also a point of high leverage, because it kind of allows the government to focus on one thing, but it also preserves a lot of the openness and flexibility for citizens. And so my desire is to achieve a balance where governments realize that they have to create sensible policies and regulations for usage, because users always have the option of using crypto without having to ask permission from their government. And so trying to figure out how to use crypto as a way to balance the scales of power more towards the citizenry without undermining the value of government, which is something that I think is very common in crypto. Our researcher Mario actually wrote an essay on these questions. Mario is, I don't know how to describe him, but one of the things that he is a brilliant economic historian. And so he has kind of a long view on the evolutions of governments and their interactions with technologies and so on that are great to explore. That post is on our website.
Totally. And do you buy the sort of sovereign individual thesis that we will, transform from citizens of governments, i.e., we exist to serve them, to customers of governments, they exist to serve us, and that, if money and state become decoupled, or military and state become, somewhat decoupled, they'll become somewhat commoditized.
Yeah.
This great fragmentation or sort of innovation in markets for governance.
I struggle with that question because or with that proposition, because on one hand, yes, but this kind of dynamic is unevenly distributed. What I mean by that is that is actually already the case in the current kind of social regime or global regime. The thing is, it's only available to the very wealthy. If you're very wealthy, you are a customer of governments. You can move pretty easily. You can move from, not only is a question of affording it, to get on a plane and go somewhere, but basically the entire tax haven business or industry and the whole thing about moving your wealth around the world is kind of that playing out. It's much harder to do that at a true kind of global equal access scale, because the reality is that the vast majority of people in the world literally cannot leave the place where they were born. And so then, it doesn't matter that there's this global marketplace for governments if you can't even get on a flight to go to the other place where you would want to go. And then the way society has organized itself thus far, the other governments make it really difficult for you to do that. And so there is wealth discrimination when it comes to the services of governments. Governments want people, they want people who they think will add value, and they end up discarding the people who probably need mobility the most. And so that's my struggle with that, is I have a hard time seeing how that ends up playing out for the benefit of all humans as opposed to a very few.
Do you believe in the charter city movement, which I believe is trying to partner with some of the poorer countries and bring sort of early adopters who want to experiment with governance into these countries? But I'm curious more broadly how you think the information revolution or governance on the web and with crypto will revolutionize offline governance, and if these sort of this explosion or in 100 or 200 years from now be sort of like what it is today with minor changes here and there.
Right. There's 200 years from now, who knows, right? 200 years from now, it's obviously impossible to know. We can look at 200 years before now and look at how far we've come and how much society has changed, and kind of estimate a change of equal scale. And so, maybe 200 years from now, we don't exist as humans, but maybe there will be enough liquidity in devices and connectivity and networks that we get to replace institutions with networks, or networks become the new institutions. And so these are all of the cyberpunk ideas around, or maybe not cyberpunk, but the ideas that we can govern all of society with internet and direct voting and crypto, and the work that Democracy OS is doing, which is fantastic on kind of building these tools for societies or groups to organize themselves, or even the work that Aragon is doing that can be applied for these purposes. And we're starting to see, in the spirit of jurisdictional competition, we're starting to see countries kind of embrace these more progressive ways of managing themselves. So I do think that we will get a flattening of the hierarchy as a result of these technologies. Part of me thinks that it will end up being kind of in the same place in unpredictable ways. And I'll reference another post that Mario wrote, a governance researcher, that he calls the full circle hypothesis. The idea that we're doing all of this work to try and fix the problems that we're seeing, and then long term, do we end up in the same kind of dynamics and constructions? And that goes back to the question of is there a natural gravity or a law of concentration or things like that emerges. And I think there's lots of reasons for that. People don't like to make decisions in general, and so outsourcing decisions is something that I think it's clear that people generally want to do. But for the short term, I'm less focused on the idea that the edge, say, the average person will be involved in the governance of systems and governments, so much as I am focused on distribution of capital. From the point of view of, I've narrowed down my focus on crypto to the one thing that I really care about is distributing capital over the internet. To me, crypto is about capital over IP. It's a whole bunch of other things as well, but this is what I think is the highest leverage kind of area of focus when it comes to affecting change in society. And the example that I want to use for that is actually it has nothing to do with distributing capital over IP directly, but in this context of mobility and people moving around geographies and all of the geopolitical changes that we are observing in real time that will continue to happen over the next several years, with everything from political dissent to mass migrations as a result of climate change. One thing that I think is critical is the ability of people to take their capital with them. And it's the kind of thing where when chaos hits your society, your tribe, your group, your country, there's few other things out there that let you take your assets and go. You can take your private, if your wealth is in crypto, you can take your private keys and go. And you can go from A to B, and you're taking your stuff with you in a very lightweight way. When you're operating under the kind of centralized regimes, you can't do that. And we see that with capital controls and all of that. That's less tangible to people who kind of operate in developed, stable, safe economies on a day-to-day basis. But it is something that affects or is really a concern for the majority of the world at the end of the day. And so that is where I'm focusing my time on, more about the distribution of wealth than the distribution of governance.
And unpack that evolution. Why did you have sort of the original view that you had? What changed and what changed your view to focus more on capital here?
So I've been a venture capitalist for 5 years. And so it was a little awkward when, a year or two ago, I asked myself, what is capital? And I did a few years of economics in undergrad, and I knew everything I had been taught at economics about what capital was supposed to be. And I went and revisited all of that and found that I just wasn't satisfied with a lot of the definitions that are out there for capital. First of all, there's so many definitions of capital. And I noticed that they were kind of rooted in the time that they came up. And so a lot of the definitions, a lot of the classic definitions are very industrial, or very, about production. We go back to Marx and we go back to, Keynes and all of that stuff. And so they're very much focused on that kind of paradigm. But then what's happened since we started talking about capital, hundreds of years ago to now, is that not only have the definitions expanded, so have the types of capital. Now it's not only, capital in the form of land. Now we have, productive capital and real capital and financial capital and social capital and political capital, environmental capital, natural capital, all of these kinds of capital for which the traditional definitions don't always apply. And so I basically went down this rabbit hole and came full circle and realized that capital was ultimately control. That is the one thing that all the forms and types and definitions of capital have in common. And so basically the idea is that the capital of the system is essentially the mechanism of control of that system. So if you ultimately, capital is control over economic resources. If you have a lot of social capital, you have some form of control over social attention, mood, activity. So you have, 10 million followers on Instagram. You can do a lot of that with that amount of social capital. versus if you only have 100 followers. Similar, with political capital, it's another fussy one that it's not very well understood, but it's similar in that way. It represents some kind of control. And so that's when governance became a capital question for me, because, and I try to explore this in a post titled Crypto Network Governance as Capital. But the notion that ultimately the holding of capital is capital as an instrument of control, then if we distribute capital more broadly, and I know I'm talking from like a 60,000 foot view here, if we distribute capital more broadly and we focus on that aspect of things, then we don't necessarily have to focus so much on building governance systems that scale to millions and millions of people, because that's a very difficult coordination problem and arguably impossible if you go by some of the research that's been done on governance systems. But if we end up distributing the things that influences governance, which is the capital behind these systems more broadly, then can we get in a place where the capital itself is distributed enough that the people who actually make the decisions and execute on things behave in a better way. It's a bit fussy, but what I'm thinking about is the distinction between a system whose capital is very, very concentrated versus a system whose capital is not. So if you think of Facebook, the capital of Facebook is represented by its shares of stock is heavily, heavily concentrated. And so a really small group of people, maybe a few hundred people, have a lot of influence over the lives of billions of people. And so there you have a system that touches a whole bunch of people, but the capital is concentrated amongst a small few, and the incentives that they have are very different from the incentives of everyone who is a stakeholder in the system. But if you distribute that power more broadly, or that influence more broadly, it's not so much that you want those billion people involved in the decision-making process, but rather you want to create new systems such that the people who are involved in the decision-making process do so in a way that advantages everyone else as opposed to just themselves.
Jesse Walden had a blog post or two about what crypto networks really enabling is sort of sustainable co-ops or co-ops that really make money. Is that resonate?
Yeah, it does.
You had a note about time and money, and it was and maybe what's really worth redistributing, or what wealth redistribution should include, is the distribution of time.
Yeah, I was thinking about time and money, as you said, and I was thinking about that phrase that money doesn't buy you happiness, and it's true. But money can buy you a lot of time, and time you can invest it into happiness. What I was reflecting on as I was thinking about these things was how much of not having money is actually about not having time to do things that make you happy, and how that ends up being a source of distress more than the lack of money itself. And I was thinking about little things like I think I was at an airport when this happened. And it's even, marginal things like, the farther up in the front of the plane you are, that saves you 20, 30, 40 minutes. And that ends up being a money thing, right? And so that is, the distribution of time. The way I think about that is distribution of wealth is one kind of problem. But if we think about if what we want to achieve is giving more people a chance at living the life that they want to live, giving them more time to have leisure, more time to spend doing the things that they want is really the thing that matters much more than money.
Totally. Before this podcast, we were talking about Carlota Perez and how we've been influenced by her, and you were talking about how you originally thought that crypto was sort of a new technological revolution, but then realized by talking to Carlota that it was part of the existing, information revolution, but that because of that, it was even bigger. Talk about what you mean by that and what you discovered.
When I joined USV, which was the firm I used to work at before Placeholder, the first thing they handed me was Carlota's book on technological revolutions and financial capital, which had been key to the founding of Union Square Ventures. And became part of the thesis of Union Square Ventures, and so that was passed down onto me, and I started looking at crypto through that lens. I thought of crypto or of blockchain as a technological revolution. I thought of a blockchain as something that would kickstart a 50-year, 60-year innovation cycle and all of that. And I operated under that notion for a long time until meeting Carlotta. So what happened is, I think through Twitter, my partner Chris got in touch with Carlotta, and we scheduled a call, and we were really excited to talk with her about crypto, because this was just when we were starting Placeholder, and we had used Carlotta's work as part of our thesis work, and so we were excited to do that. And then so I was a little surprised when she was pretty adamant about the fact that crypto was not a technological revolution at all, but rather an expression of the maturity of information technology as a technological revolution. So the way Carlotta saw it, and maybe to put some context to these ideas, Carlotta has a framework that describes the relationship between technological innovation and financial capital, where she splits innovation cycles in technology in kind of two phases. A period or two main periods. One is the emergence of the technology, and it's a kind of 20 to 30 year period where the technology is invented and it's iterated on and it's kind of built up over time. And then there's a second phase where the technology reaches a place of maturity and it starts actually making its way to the fabric of society. And so in her book, she goes back, she's thinking about technology more broadly. She's not thinking about digital technology or anything. She goes back to railroads and electricity and telecommunications and those big technological revolutions, those kind of large scale ones. And so I thought that crypto was one of those, that blockchain was one of those, but Carlotta correctly pointed out that crypto is still within the information technology revolution. And it is. It's an information technology. And none of the technology is actually new. We're still using the same hardware paradigms, the same, networks and things like that. Technologies, we're just arranging them in different ways. And so initially I was a little disappointed that at that notion that crypto wasn't a technological revolution. But then that got me thinking about, what kind of revolution it was, or it is. And it made me realize that it's a socioeconomic revolution, in the sense that she's right. It's information technology making its way to the deeper fabrics of society. And when you think about what we're building with crypto and what's resonating with people and what's taking off, is precisely things that are challenging the basic structures of capitalism. We're redesigning money, we're redesigning markets, we're redesigning organizations. All of these foundational elements. We're creating new institutions, and ultimately, crypto is more about different ways of organizing economic activity than it is innovation on technology. But that actually increased the scale of crypto for me, because it was no longer, a cool new technology. It was this more profound shift in the way that we manage society.
And let's unpack that a little bit. Paint a picture of what that could look like. Earlier in this interview, you talked about how it goes way beyond currency. And when I asked Mario for a question, he asked, "What does everyday life interactions look like in a world where most of what you believe and hopes will happen actually happens?" And he asked, "What new problems might stem from that?" So why don't you sort of paint some visuals for what this could look like?
So just for everyone's context, Mario was a student of Carlotta's. We met Mario around the time that we started talking with Carlotta, and as I mentioned earlier, he has this kind of very deep knowledge of kind of the history of society and the economy and so on. And so there's a lot of things that we find in crypto that he very quickly goes like, "Yep, we've been here before, and we went through this before," and things like that. So painting a visual, I used to be a lot more imaginative, actually, where I could paint you that cryptonauts vision of you're fully independent and self-sovereign, and you have your keys in your hardware wallet that you carry with you, or however, and you can move freely from border to border, and your passport's a token, and your identity is all your data is on your phone or your device, and you kind of interact with systems through blockchains, and the idea being that we kind of get rid of companies and we get rid of governments, or they become very, very minimal, and we manage everything through networks. That is great for a sci-fi book. It's much harder to actually see, or at the very least, that future may outlive us, or it may come way past our time. But this is actually trying to work through my idealism is how I ended up coming back down to capital as the one kind of object of focus, because I think most of society's problems stem from the maldistribution of capital, and I can unpack that a little bit further. But to go back to the currency or the payment or the money question. To me, cryptocurrencies as a means of payment, or that original notion that we're going to use these systems to pay for things on a day-to-day basis, it is a little bit like saying that the internet is only email. And it's kind of an interesting time to be talking about this, because we have Facebook in front of the U.S. Congress fighting this kind of nasty fight over a payment system at the end of the day, which to me feels a little silly, because it's kind of like, it's focused on the wrong thing. And now the email analogy works because email is a fundamental part of the web. The web runs on email. It absolutely does. Everything comes down to email. Email is your personal data store. It's your identity. It's your backup. It's a whole bunch of things. It is foundational infrastructure for the web, and that one's easy to argue, but it's far from the most important thing that we do, or maybe that's not the right way to say it, but it's far from the most valuable activity that we do on the web, or at the very least, I'll say that obviously we do a lot more than just email on the web. So to me, the money payment function of Bitcoin and so on is like email. It's going to be huge and fundamental, and going to reach the highest level of scale in terms of the applications, or relative to other applications, because it's such a foundational layer. But I'm more interested in the things we get to do once we have this foundational layer of self-sovereign payment systems. And what I think we get to build on top of that is new capital distribution systems. And I've been playing around with the words here just for my own fun, where I've started to think of crypto networks as CDNs, but not content delivery networks, more as capital delivery networks. And this is all the stuff that I've been exploring with crypto network governance as capital, and how much of the new things that we're building in crypto networks are really capital systems. A DAO is really a capital system. Crypto network is really a capital system. And so starting to think about crypto through the lens of capital has given me an opportunity to have a better sense of how this technology actually can change the lives of the people that use them. And so that's been a little bit of my progression. So, to go back to your original question and paint you a picture, I'm no longer kind of idealist about this kind of super decentralized future. I think we'll have a wide variety of centralized and decentralized organizations and systems that will integrate with all of these technologies in various ways. But the future that I want to see, and the future that I'm driving towards, is one where really it's as simple as distributing capital over the internet. What I want to see is people interact with services much in the same way that they interact with services today, like Facebook and Google and Twitter and so on, but where the users end up becoming stakeholders in these systems, where instead of organizing these services under the equity paradigm, which is an industrial capitalist model, can we use crypto to create an information capital model where everyone participates in the value created by the networks? And so thinking about how to just literally put more capital in people's hands now that we can represent it digitally and distribute it over the internet, that's one way in which I think crypto is going to end up changing the way we structure ourselves fundamentally, even though 10, 20 years from now, it may seem like it's an incremental change. So I'll just narrow it down to I want to increase the number of capital holders by orders of magnitude using crypto. And I think that ends up then cascading into more profound social changes.
And is that evolution in your paradigm from full decentralized sovereignty to capital over IP more so because it's pragmatic and something we can achieve sooner, or because that's actually more a hybrid approach is more ideal, and that the fully decentralized approach is not just far in the future, but also maybe not the best way to go?
Yeah, it's a bit of all of them. So the first one has to do with the full self-sovereign individual vision is not very pragmatic when you consider a wide variety of things. And I'm being a little hand wavy about it because it's a very complicated thing, but it's really about just how complex society is. And the thing that I think is very difficult is trying to design systems and rules that scale and evolve and at a really large scale. And so I'm struggling to describe it, but I think there's a natural limit to how large a system of people can get before it corrupts itself or breaks down. And so there's part of me that's a little afraid of a hyper sovereign future. And I struggle with these things personally because I kind of have two sides to my argument based on the different places where I've lived and experienced things. Where I've lived in places where there's very, very dysfunctional governments, and this, the fabric of those societies is such that it requires centralization to fix in a way, where there's problems that you can't fix with decentralization. There's problems that you fix with centralization. And so I no longer think that there is one solution to everything, and it's decentralization. Some problems require centralization to solve, and some require decentralization. And I think it's hard to make those decisions kind of on a blanket basis. But there's one thing that I know for sure that is universally positive, which is increasing wealth distribution. And this more kind of pragmatic approach, it's still a difficult problem. But it's a more limited scope, where the ideas that I'm playing with is, okay, if capital is control and influence, then we don't necessarily have to design very specific and prescribed systems for how to run society, but rather if we spread the influence over the system a little bit more, maybe organically, we end up constructing new ways of relating to each other, or new ways of governing ourselves or making decisions. And so it has to do with this kind of realization that the more wealth you have, the more influence you have, and the more options and freedom and time you have. And so let's spread that more widely, and maybe that'll allow us to organically create better systems rather than try to design the perfect system up front.
Yeah, makes sense. And you talked about in previous podcasts, the sort of concern that you have is currency and capital became separate. And so I'm curious if you can give some historical background for how that happened under modern capitalism, and then be going to unpack deeper why a lot of the problems or what problems stem from inequality and sort of wealth distribution. And in a world where wealth was more evenly distributed beyond the moral benefits of fairness, which are very real, what are the practical benefits we would see as a result of it?
Yep. So there's something I like to think about, which I like to call the unbundling of money. And it comes from the definition of money that is most often used or thrown around, particularly in crypto, when we talk about a lot of these as monetary systems. And the common definition for money is that it's a thing or an instrument that serves as a means of exchange, a unit of account, and the store of value. And what those things mean is means of exchange is, you can use this to trade it for other goods and services or for any other good and service within an economy. Unit of account means that it is the unit in which the value of the goods and services in the economy are measured. So basically the unit of pricing. So in the US and in many other parts of the world, we measure the value of things in dollars. And so the dollar serves as a unit of account. And then a store of value, which at a minimum means that it should maintain its value over time. So that's what money's supposed to be. When you look at what we actually have, we don't really have anything that fits or under the current world or the legacy economy, let's call it. I think the kids are calling it the boomer economy now. We don't have a single instrument that does all of those three things. What's happened is that we've kind of unbundled those three functions of money into different asset types or classes. So the first one, which is a means of exchange, has actually gone to debt. And what's happened over the last several decades is that increasingly we're using debt to transact rather than actual currency and or actual money or actual dollars or any other national currency. And that's something that the average person or citizen doesn't see, because what you see in your bank account, you see your checking account balance and you see your credit card balance. You kind of understand that a credit card is debt and all of that, but the user interface to debt has become really sophisticated, and so we don't really see it on a day-to-day basis. But when you peel back the layers into the financial system, you realize that there's a lot more debt being used to transact in general in the economy than transactions involving actual exchange of dollars. And that goes down to how money is actually created in the economy. And a subtle thing that's happened in the last few decades is that essentially central banks have outsourced the money creation or the money supply creation function to commercial banks who create money by creating debt. And it's, that relationship is very clear when you swipe a credit card. There's debt that's being created, and that debt is moving from one bank's balance sheet to another bank's balance sheet. And so in the background, we see dollars moving around in the user interfaces to the legacy financial system, but by and large, it's debt. And it goes down even to how governments end up creating more money or kind of exact influence on the economy. They do that by incurring debt at the national level. And so it's basically debt all the way down that we use to transact. And that's not, terrible in and of itself, in the sense that it actually, part of the reason we ended up in this system is that it's actually more efficient for central banks to operate this way, because it gets us to where we are now, where you can effectively control the money supply by just manipulating one variable, which is the interest rate. And so as a central bank, as the economy grows, it is a more effective way of managing the monetary supply versus prior economic models or monetary models, where, for example, when we had the gold standard, manipulating the money supply was very, very difficult and expensive, because you actually had to acquire more gold to issue more currency or to issue more money. And so, that's happened. It has benefits and it has, it has pros and cons. But by and large, debt is the number one means of exchange in society, not actual dollars or euros or any other currency. So that's what's happened with means of exchange. Fiat remains as unit of account by and large, and we use fiat to measure the scale of debt. And so, and we use fiat to price things. And so, fiat money, or what we think of as money generally, is still used very much as a unit of account. But then, we get to store of value, and that one is the tricky one, because store of value effectively went to capital. And the thing is that store of value and debt are opposed. Debt is far from a store of value. Debt is the opposite of store of value. Debt loses value over time, versus a store of value, which we established at the very least maintains its value over time. And I'm talking at a really high level here, because obviously within capital, there's so much. It's an entire universe of different assets and kinds and all of those things. But if you take capital as a category, if you take everything that is capital and you put it in a single bucket, that is the store of value of the world. And if we go back to our new definition of capital as control over economic resources, really it means that the economic resources, which are scarce resources, everything that we have in the world, that's really what stores value. And so we ended up in this model where generally what we used to transact is debt, whether we're aware of it or not. And this has a long history. There's a famous book, which I actually haven't read, but that deals with the history of debt over 5,000 years or so. And it really makes the point of how debt is what we used to transact. Fiat ended up being mostly a unit of account, but that separation between those two things made it more efficient for the economy to scale, because then governments could manipulate the money supply with much easier mechanisms. But then we have store of value and capital. And so capital is the only thing that tends to not only store value, but appreciate in value, grow in value over time. So now we have these three things. We have debt, we have fiat, and we have capital, and they perform independently the three money functions. And so far there's very good reasons why we ended up in this organization. The problem is that most people live their lives in currency, and very few people live their lives in capital. And currency, and what I call currency, is basically a means of exchange and unit of account. That's, currency. Debt is really the currency that we use. Currency is what we use to actually transact and engage in exchanges. And so most people live their lives in currency. What I mean by that is most people get a job, work for a company, and they receive an income, a salary, or a paycheck from that company in currency, in dollars. But we've established that that's pretty much debt, which loses value over time. Whereas very few people live their lives in capital. And what I mean by that is people who derive their wealth or their income from capital. So it's the difference between the employee who works for the company and the people who own the company. And what ends up happening is that over time, if you just kind of zoom out and just look at the economy from space, if you have most people living in currency, which is really debt, which loses value over time, and you have very few people living in capital, which is a store of value, which increases in value over time, then you can start to see how over time, as the economy develops, the majority of people end up losing wealth and becoming increasingly poor over time, while the let's call it the capital class increases their wealth over time, and we end up with these now very dangerous, literally dangerous levels of wealth inequality. But the problem is not capital itself. I think a lot of public policy focuses on how do we redistribute wealth or redistribute income, or how do we kind of, there's this kind of evil tone to the word capital and so on, the capitalists and those things. But you can't get rid of capital. If capital is, control over economic resources and all of these things, you can't actually get rid of it. So the only solution I see is let's distribute capital more broadly. Let's bring more people over to the capital side. Let's try and bring everyone to the capital side, so that instead of let's minimize the number of people who live in currency and debt, and instead maximize the number of people who live in capital. Now, the reason that's very hard to do in the current industrial economy is that distributing capital is very expensive. And if we come down from, to a more practical level, the forms of capital, the instruments of capital that we have today, like shares of stock in companies, or bonds, or all of these instruments that we've created, they're very expensive to distribute. If you try to transfer a share of stock of a private company from one individual to another, it's a very, very expensive transaction. Similar, even after a company goes public, which is meant to make the exchange of capital or the distribution of capital much cheaper, even then, when you take a more global perspective, it's very difficult. And the example I like to use is an example from back home, which is that you can be in the Dominican Republic, a relatively wealthy family or a middle class family, and have $50,000 to $100,000 in savings, which is a lot of money down there. It's a lot of money here, but it's a lot of money down there. And there you're wealthy. You can be in that position. You are way ahead. You're in the 1% of the Dominican Republic if you're in that situation. You can't buy a share of Apple stock. You can't go to your local bank and say, hey, I want a share of Apple stock, or I want a share of Amazon stock, or I want a share of Google. It's just not available to you. The financial system is too expensive to scale on a global basis. And so you may have the money to buy that capital, to access that wealth, but you literally cannot. And that is exactly the problem that I think we get to solve with blockchains and crypto, because now we get to create digital capital instruments and then distribute it over the internet, because you can put a token in anyone's phone if they have a wallet. And so that's, kind of studying this history and this kind of setup of the current incarnation of capitalism is what led me to realize this kind of divide between the currency class and the capital class, and understanding that the solution to that problem is not increasing redistribution, but rather designing systems that have pre-distribution built in, where can we design these new capital distribution networks that actually put more capital in more people's hands and bring them over to the capital side, as opposed to leaving them in the debt and currency side.
Totally. And let's segue into your investment focus today, your investment thesis today, or what types of things you're looking to invest in. I'm curious how the evolution you're thinking that you just talked about, but broadly the evolution of how the space has evolved has led to any evolution in the sort of the placeholder investment thesis or focus, or what types of things you're looking to invest in today.
I'm thinking back to our summary thesis from when we started the firm, and if I haven't read it in a while, but if I remember it correctly, we were very much focused on infrastructure from the point of view of technology. So what I like to call application infrastructure. And this goes back to this notion that we started out more in the technological side, and then now realizing that it's more of a socio-political matter or a socio-economic matter, that we were looking at things like decentralized storage and decentralized compute and transcoding and these things, because if you're thinking about decentralizing the web or decentralizing the internet, that's where you'll go. And we've made a number of investments in that category, and we continue to make them. And we definitely believe that application infrastructure is an important foundational layer of crypto. But as we've been exploring these broader kind of notions, I'm starting to realize that a lot of what we think is consumer services, maybe not consumer services, but for example, DeFi is a kind of infrastructure, decentralized finance. When you think of crypto as a socioeconomic revolution, all of a sudden the ability to have self-sovereign credit systems, self-sovereign exchanges, self-sovereign stable coins and things like that, those become economic infrastructure. And so I would say that one big iteration or evolution of our thesis is an expansion of what we think of as infrastructure. Now we think of two kinds of infrastructure. There's application infrastructure and economic infrastructure. What's interesting about those two kinds is that we've actually struggled with the application infrastructure, and it mostly because they're very hard computer science problems. A lot of people kind of see crypto infrastructure as being immature, which it is, because creating a robust decentralized file storage system is very difficult, and creating a robust decentralized CDN and all of these things, they're very hard. And so that actually takes quite a bit. But we've been seeing a lot more traction and activity around the economic infrastructure, in part because the technologies that we have today kind of are good enough to allow us to design and test these systems. And so it's the stuff that we can actually use. But it's also subtly a kind of infrastructure that I think doesn't initially seem like it is. But when you start thinking about this kind of broader concept of, okay, we're going to create these global economies and we're going to distribute capital over IP, we need a financial system that is natively digital that can deal with these new forms of capital. And so everything that we're doing in DeFi has this kind of North Star with it. We need to build, just as we need to build base layer blockchains that allow us to distribute the ledger, and we need to build application infrastructure so that we can distribute information. DeFi is infrastructure. These protocols are infrastructure for the distribution of economic value. And that's something that we've been spending a lot of our time on.
Yeah. Danny Grant from USV and Nick had this post about application and infrastructure. It's basically the punchline is we sort of expect us to start out with infrastructure and then build applications on top. But they talked about how sometimes it's the applications first that pull sort of the need for infrastructure. I'm curious if that post resonated, if you have a difference of opinion there. And Danny Grant also has this post that she hasn't yet published called "The New Thing versus the New Old Thing," where basically she says that anytime there's a new technology like the web, like crypto, sort of use cases that could only be created by that new technology tend to work at first because there's no competition. And then as the sort of infrastructure gets built out, et cetera, and adoption happens, then sort of the new old things start working. And the example of old things is, Webvan versus Instacart or Pets.com versus, Chewy.
Yeah.
Does that resonate with you? Or
so I have a different take on the same, let's call it, idea, which I describe different. Danny's super smart. She sometimes intimidates me with how smart she is. The way I think about it is, two kinds of innovation when a new technology emerges, where and these are bad terms, but it helps me think about it. Kind of below the standard, below the technology, and above the technology. But really, what I mean is, the first kinds of applications that we see, I actually think are the old things. When we take the new technology to do things that we know well and understand, and we do get the new things at around the same time, but they take a little longer to materialize. So I have the same observation, but I think about it kind of in reverse. And the observation there is that early on, when we have this new tool and we don't quite know how to use it very well, it's easier to imagine how to use it to improve the things that we already understand. And in the context of crypto, arguably Bitcoin is tackling an old problem. It's money, it was trying to fix payments and money and these issues with the not only technological issues but also governance issues around the monetary system and so on. But we're kind of working within a problem that already exists, or a market that already exists. There's already a market for money. There's already a financial system to go out and work with, and we're seeing it also in DeFi today. A lot of the early innovation that we're seeing is taking the new tool to recreate credit markets, to recreate transaction ledgers, to recreate payment systems and saving systems and so on. And I do think it has to do with our lack of imagination in a way early on when we don't quite know. Now, the new things, there's no market for them in that they do emerge earlier, but they tend to be much smaller for that reason. And they end up being the things that end up capturing the most value long term. The example that I like to use is if you go to the internet, a lot of the early traction or a lot of the early innovation in the 90s, for instance, was square within the things and markets that we understood. It was a lot of media. It was a lot of early search engines, for example, where it didn't look like Google at all. And before we had even a search paradigm, we had portals, Yahoo and AOL and a bunch of others, which were these massive front pages that had collections of links and looked very much like the cover page of a newspaper, because we were coming from that paradigm. We were thinking, okay, we take a newspaper and we put it online, and that's how we distribute information. But it wasn't until what we now call Web 2.0 that the more native implementations of web systems started to emerge. Another example I like to use from that era is, because that's an internet example. We can also look at another thing that was going on around that time, which was Linux. And Linux came up in 1991, and one of the earliest companies to capitalize on that was Red Hat, which took the new free operating system to essentially compete with Microsoft, use the cost savings of Linux from the point of view of, we don't have to invest in the development of this software. Rather, we can focus on the implementation and the support, and we can compete with Microsoft by offering an operating system solution at a lower price. But really, ultimately, the real value created by Linux came from the fact that it is the most common operating system by far, used by pretty much every web service. But back then, it wasn't clear that Linux's ultimate purpose was to be the operating system of the internet. And so, I think it's the same kind of idea and observation, except I think that the old use cases end up coming up first, and that the new stuff does come up at around the same time, but takes much longer to develop. In terms of the applications versus infrastructure and the chicken on the egg thing, I think it's a chicken on the egg thing. We had those debates, and I think sometimes it's one and sometimes it's the other. Yeah, I don't have a strong opinion on that one.
And actually, it's interestingly enough, there were some things that I discovered via the crypto community that I could only discover perhaps via the crypto community, but it was unclear to me that you needed crypto or blockchain to do them. So like prediction markets or, income share agreements, or even charter cities, as we were discussing before. I'm curious what sort of new use case, mentioned DAOs a little bit, what new use cases you're excited about, or if you sort of had a request for startups or protocols or innovation for all the builders out there who are looking at what to build in the space. What might you recommend, or what do you want to see experimented on or built?
So the two new things that I am most intrigued by these days are, you mentioned DAOs, that's one of them, and the other one is NFTs, non-fungible tokens, the stuff that makes CryptoKitties run. And the DAO one, DAOs are something we've been working on for a while. Aragon was actually one of our first ever investments, and Aragon built a series of tools that make it easy for consumers to create DAOs. And we've gone through, the DAO hype cycle within crypto in a variety of ways. The thing that I'm now kind of realizing about DAOs is I had a number of experiences growing up. I grew up on the internet. I learned to code early and learned to build websites when I was a kid. And so I was part of that kind of internet culture. And I remember what it felt like to, make a website and throw it online and, have people come to it and, interact with those people and talk with them. And I had many experiences growing up where I built web apps and applications with people all over the world from my computer, and we coordinated everything. And when I saw DAOs, it felt like that. It felt like, this feels like that kind of interaction where you can use the internet to bring a group of people together to coordinate themselves into doing something. Now, back then we did it with email and PayPal and things like that, and now we get to do it with blockchains. Now, the thing that I'm just so curious about is how are DAOs going to surprise us? And so we have, by and large, been thinking about DAOs from within the current paradigms of thinking. And you look at something like Aragon, it's very much designed in that way. You look at it, it looks like the operating system of a company. You have, members and payrolls and tokens and voting and proposals and, all of those kind of typical organization things. But then you look at other things like Moloch DAO, which is a super simple DAO with a clearly defined set of rules. It's a very stupid system, but it also is incredibly flexible because of how simple and lightweight it is. And it's kind of like a standard DAO model that is now being used for many, many different things. And a Moloch DAO is little more than an economic coordination system. You put assets in this DAO. when you contribute assets to the DAO, you get voting shares in the DAO on how those assets are used. And then if you don't like how the votes are worked, or, if there's a vote that looks like it's going to pass and you don't like it, you can do a rage quit and take your money out of the DAO and then not participate in that decision. And that's it. That's all it does. But that allows for a big universe of things that you can do with just those simple rules that don't quite exist in the traditional model. You can't do that with a company quite the same way. You can't. I mean, you could if you wrote those features into a contract, but there's no way you can make it work at a global scale with anonymous people and, automated payments and so on. It's a very painful thing to try and, create the same mechanisms within a traditional paper legal structure. And so the idea that with DAOs, we collapse those, not those functions, but we make organizations more efficiently. We also increase the kind of the sign space of organizations. I'm just watching very closely at the kinds of things that may emerge from DAOs as a concept. I think DAOs, when it comes to this question of capital and participation and governance, DAOs are one thing that I think will be fundamental to crypto in ways that are unpredictable today. And NFTs, I think, exist in a similar space where a lot of what we're doing with NFTs kind of mirrors things that we already know and understand, like collecting things like art and things like that. But NFTs as a mechanism for transacting in unique information, if you want to think about it and very abstractly, that has the potential to change a lot of how we do things like authorizations and even operate transactions in the web. And that sounds very impractical, but I'll describe something that a team that we work with is kind of thinking about. Fortmatic, which builds a key management system for dApps and users, has been thinking about an authorization scheme that works with an NFT type of mechanism, where if you think of non-fungible tokens as representing a variety of things, but unique things like access or a license or things like that. I think we can kind of build systems with NFTs that are kind of hard to imagine today, but as carriers of information, transferable carriers of information, it's one of those things that I feel old because I struggle to imagine how we could create brand new things with them, but that I'm sure a young entrepreneur from a random part of the world who's coming at this, as a teenager and doesn't have a preconception of the world, or doesn't have the world's paradigms drilled into them in quite the same way, will come up with innovative ways of using them. So I already feel like the old generation, where when I try to imagine things that we can do with crypto, I feel like I'm inventing Alta Vista, where I take the things that I know and I'm putting them on crypto, whereas the younger generations are coming up with things that I frankly can't come up with, but that I'm trying to stay close to.
What do you think about 2100, or broadly speaking?
I love that. Yeah.
Maybe
I love it.
Why you find that's interesting, and
yeah,
broadly what that type of stuff could lead to.
Yeah, and that's exactly the kind of thing that I'm thinking about. When I'm glad that you mentioned it, because it's an example that I like to use of the kinds of things that just you couldn't quite do before. And 2100, I love to use that one as in the context of this notion of capital, where, backing up a little bit, I went on a monologue about capital, but I didn't touch upon something that is key when it comes to the relationship between capital and crypto, which is that you heard me say that you can't get rid of capital, that capital is this kind of permanent force in society. There's a distinction between capital and capital instruments. And this one, I kind of came about in an odd way, but basically the capital instruments are abstractions on top of capital, and specifically tradable abstractions. Capital is control, but capital instruments are the mechanisms that we use to encode that control and then to make it tradable. So to make that a little more tangible, the capital of a company, or of a standard normal company, is represented with equity shares of stock as the instrument. So the shares of stock in a company are the instrument for its capital. And the thing that you trade and the thing that you transact are the shares of stock, right? That's how you transfer capital from one person to the other. You do it through the instrument. But the instrument is a social abstraction. We create instruments as legal contracts and we use courts to back them up and all of those things. And so that's what gives them their functionality. And also another important thing about instruments is that because instruments make capital tradable, you can't price capital effectively, nor you can exchange capital if you don't have instruments for it. And the reason this is so important is that going back to the notion that we have many, many different kinds of capital, when you look at it, we have a lot more types of capital than we have types of capital instruments. And what I mean by that is for things like productive capital, we have instruments like shares of stock and so on. For things like real capital, or like land or buildings and so on, we have property rights or property titles that are the instrument that represents that. So if you sell me a building or a house, what allows you to do that is the fact that you have a property title. That's the instrument that you actually give me. And by transferring that instrument to me, I now have that capital. But for something like political capital, for instance, it exists. We can observe it, but there's no instrument for political capital. There's no tool or device that we can use to trade it. And because there's no way for us to trade it, there's no way for a market to emerge around it who can price it and value it. And there's also no way for that capital to be more broadly distributed because you can't exchange it. You can't take it from one person and give it to another one. And so all of the other forms of capital that we've been discovering over the last several decades don't have instruments attached to them. And so you think of social capital, and I use the example of Instagram followers or social media followers, that it forms part of your social capital, but there's no instrument around it. And you look at something like 2100, and it provides a tool for creating an instrument for your social capital. And that's the kind of thing that blows my mind, because when you think of blockchains and crypto and all of these technologies as tools for creating capital instruments, then the space of experimentation or the kind of thought space expands by quite a bit, or at least it does for me. And so what I want to encourage people or developers and entrepreneurs to think about is what kinds of instruments they can design for different kinds of capital that exist out there that allow us to create new markets and new kinds of tools and devices. And 2100 is a perfect example of a new design for an instrument for social capital that we cannot recreate with paper and legal contracts in quite the same way.
Totally. One of the things you mentioned in a previous interview is that you guys do pre-mortems. If the crypto space doesn't work, why not? And I'm curious. And you also wrote sort of the Ethereum as IBM post. Some people sometimes say, hey, Bitcoin is the MySpace or the Alta Vista. There's another group of people that says, we should look at these things through the lens of the history of money, perhaps through an Austrian economics lens, rather than the history of software, history of technology, and that there's a sort of fundamental different implications that emerge from those different lenses. I'm curious how you would respond to that. Do you see it differently?
So I haven't thought about that notion that you should think about things from money history versus technology history. I think you have to do all of the above. This is just my immediate reaction, but I think in general, blanket statements or single points of view are less useful than more holistic approaches. And so I find it more useful to think about all these things from all of those perspectives, right? Combine the history of technology, combine the history of software with economic history, with societal history. Something that I spend a lot of time going back to is generational history. There's a bunch of theory and work that's been done on how generations work. And the marquee book there is a book titled Generations by two researchers. The names Strauss and Howie. And these are the guys who came up with the term millennial in the 1980s. They basically went back through every single American generation and mapped out, all of the different features of each generation, what was going on in society, their opinions on various institutions like government, marriage, war, kids, all of those things. A history of generations doesn't seem like it's very useful in the context of crypto, but it actually turns out to be super useful because what you learn from that is how societies' moods change over time, how they tend to change, and what are the clues and cues that let you know that there are generational shifts occurring. And so when you bring in that perspective, then you start to see how much of crypto is a function of generational change, for instance. And so that's kind of my general approach to things. You're better off grabbing from multiple points of view rather than focusing on just one, because then you might miss the bigger picture.
That makes sense. What do you think we've learned about moats in crypto, or business model, or value capture across different layers or levels of the stack? Or sort of, you wrote in your thesis a long time ago, value capture doesn't mean investment returns. But when you sort of unpack things we've learned there, or how you think about value?
Yeah. So usually when that question is asked of me, it's in the context of value capture between protocols and applications, and it goes back to posts called fat protocols that argued that protocols capture more value than applications, and in crypto, whereas on the web we had applications capture more value than protocols. More recently, I've been more vocal about one of the most common misconceptions or misinterpretations of that idea, which is really confusing value capture with investment returns. And I think a lot of people took the idea that protocols capture more value as protocols capture more investment returns, or there's only investment returns at protocols, or other misconclusions stemming from that misunderstanding. And really, value capture is less of an investment metric so much as it is, a measure of total market value or market available. It's more, when I think of value capture across layers, I'm thinking more in the context of how is market value distributed over a supply chain or over a value chain. Let's call it a value chain. If you think of protocols and applications as kind of being part of a crypto value chain, or the different layers, than the distribution of investment returns. Investment returns have a lot more to do with your cost basis, how much you've invested, and more to do with growth rates of the thing that you've invested in, or things like that. Has to do with how much ownership you have over your investment, if it's like a company or even a network. And those things work very, very differently between protocols and applications. So that's one thing that is important to understand when we talk about where value accrues in one place versus another. One thing from more of the learning side of things, and you mentioned moats. To understand value more properly, I wrote a post on how to think about value that goes back to some basic economic principles, and particularly one in specific, which is that at equilibrium in a market, marginal benefit equals marginal cost. And there's a lot of debate behind that principle that is not worth going into. But the basic premise is that costs are strong determinants of value in a market, and from an economics perspective. And you can think of as there being a direct relationship between value accrual and cost accrual in a way, in the sense that whoever takes on most of the costs then necessarily demands most of the value to cover those costs. And to make it a little bit more tangible, we can start thinking of costs more as investments. And costs and investments end up determining value in the sense that if you incur a cost and it doesn't come with the appropriate amount of value, it's an unprofitable cost to take, and so you wouldn't incur that cost. And when you start thinking about it as investments, if a layer of a value chain requires more investment to operate because it is more costly to operate, then more value has to go to that layer. In the context of crypto, the way this shows up is protocols and crypto networks are much more expensive and costly to run than the applications, meaning it's much more expensive to operate the Bitcoin network as a whole when you think about all of the costs that everyone in the Bitcoin network is taking on in order to make that service work is orders of magnitude greater than the costs of a wallet riding on top of Bitcoin, or even a large company like Coinbase riding on top of Bitcoin. When you think about all the investment that has to go into making that network work. And so by necessity, most of the value has to go to where most of the costs are to maintain equilibrium. And so that is what ends up determining value distribution between the two. But just because something captures more value does not mean that it captures more investment returns. And so a lot of what we've been doing, actually recently, we've been investing more at the application layer of crypto as the opportunities there materialize and the infrastructure becomes better, and we're getting user experiences that are only now reaching kind of web status. And so we're seeing lots of opportunities there. And by the way, I also think there's plenty of opportunities at the protocol layer, and most of our investments are in crypto networks in the protocol layer. But there is an important distinction between those two concepts that as an investor you have to understand.
And you wrote this post, web versus crypto service models. And I'm curious if we can unpack that. And a couple questions I have around it is, one, just to solidify, what were sort of the big things that the web was missing that crypto brought? Was it identity and sort of payments? Is one question. The other is sort of, what's going to be the equivalent of what aggregation theory was for the web for crypto in terms of sort of the dominant paradigm of how how these things make money?
Yeah. So I think the one thing, there's lots of things that crypto brought, but the one thing is it's very subtle. It's the shift towards public-private key-based identity and authentication and authorization. The idea that a transaction does not happen for a user unless that user has explicitly approved that transaction. And this was created for Bitcoin, right? And so it's the notion that you have your public key and you have your private key. If you use a centralized wallet or a centralized custodian provider like Coinbase, then you've delegated control of that private key, and Coinbase can theoretically make transactions for you without your permission if they decided to do that. But if you use a non-custodial wallet, which is a term that we like to use, where you all remain in control of your private key, only you can authorize transactions on your Bitcoin wallet. Now, if you take that framework or that idea or that paradigm and expand it to consumer information services more broadly, it's this notion that you can be interacting with an application, but that application cannot touch your data or manipulate it unless you've authorized it or given it explicit permission to do so. And that is something that does not exist on the web. On the web, we kind of have to trust that the services we use are managing our data correctly. And it's very clear to pretty much everyone that we can't rely on that trust. And this to me is probably the most powerful thing that crypto introduces to the kind of online consumer services model, where it's no longer a model where the application, because they are in control of the data and because they are in control of the production of the service, are effectively in control of everything. And we get all kinds of problems that emerge from that, everything from fake news to the latest controversies around political advertising and things like that. In the crypto model, where we have the opposite of that, where we have decentralized production and we have non-custodial data models where it's up to the user to decide how they want their data to be managed. You can choose to use Coinbase. You can choose to use Bitcoin directly, anonymously, and in a self-sovereign way. It's up to you. Bitcoin itself doesn't care. But you, the user, can choose your interface to the same service. And that is a big deal, because you can be using Coinbase and I can be using a Ledger wallet, and you and I can transact with each other. You expand that out from beyond Bitcoin, and it's the equivalent in, say, a social network would be that imagine Facebook were a crypto network. You could be using one interface for it. I could be using another interface for it that caters to our different needs in different ways. but you and I can still communicate and transact with each other, even though we're not on the same application. And that, I think, ends up kind of changing the power scales between users and services, where all of a sudden now users have a lot more leverage over application operators than they did in the past. And even in centralized models or semi-centralized models, a lot of what keeps Coinbase honest, for instance, is the fact that you can leave. You can just take your assets out, put them in another service, and still have access to the networks and the services. It's something that you can't do with PayPal, for instance. If you rely on PayPal, if we want to use kind of a similar analogy, yeah, you can take your money out, but once you're out of the system, you can't access PayPal the network, and PayPal the network is the thing that's useful. But it works that way on the web because we have these centralized and custodial data models. But in crypto, there's a lot more mobility for the user.
Totally. So we only have a few minutes left. So I want to get sort of my last two questions out, and you can answer whichever ones you find interesting or go deep as you see fit. So one is and both of these questions sort of emerged out of your podcast that you did on the Andreessen Horowitz podcast. One question is about relates to your desire to collapse the distinction between capital and currency. And there's this argument for every protocol having its own utility token that's functioned both as a medium of exchange and as ownership of the network. And I'm curious if you still hold that view, if there's room for distinction between sort of the owner operator class and the consumer, which is more optimal. Why? Personally, I think that's sort of the biggest experiment we're running in crypto, or one of them, is whether consumers value ownership or whether it's a cognitive burden, too much of a cognitive burden to make your users investors. That's sort of one big question. The next one, and then I'll let you go, is on on-chain governance. And basically, most evolutionary fit networks are those that can adapt to change. When does it make sense, if at all, to innovate on governance? Do protocols need to be governed by community at inception, or is it better to have a strong product leader to drive decision-making at the outlet? When should teams prioritize this?
I'll answer both, because the second one is kind of quick, which is that it depends. And it's kind of a cop-out answer, but there's cases in which starting out with the full community on-chain governance thing makes sense, and there's cases where starting centralized and progressively decentralized, we have the full range of approaches in our portfolio, and I think it's impossible to make a blanket statement about how these things work. So, for example, our investment in Decred, which has been very much built from the ground up to be self-sovereign and to have this kind of community governance functions built in from the beginning. It's for the mission they have, they could only start that way. They couldn't start in another way. Otherwise, for their specific situation, it wouldn't have worked. On the other hand, the opposite extreme is our investment in Erasure, which is a project by a company called Numerai that built a centralized system that uses crypto, and then designed a protocol called Erasure that is a decentralized version of Numerai. Numerai, by the way, is a hedge fund that's managed by an anonymous community of data scientists that submit stock market predictions to Numerai and then get paid in Numeraire, which is Numerai's token. And that was a centralized system, and Numerai started out as a very, very centralized system, then added a layer of crypto, became more decentralized, and then progressively now has evolved into Erasure, which is a much more decentralized or fully decentralized version of Numerai. And so you can have that progression. You can go from being a very centralized company to progressively decentralizing. You can stay hybrid. So I don't think there's a right answer there. I think it depends on your mission. If you're trying to be global money, then starting out as a more community-owned and operated network is probably going to be better for you. The closer you are to the consumer, the more you can probably get away with some centralization or more centralization, at least in the beginning. But ultimately, I think how decentralized you are ends up determining the scale of the network. And the reason I think that is that the more centralized it is, the harder it is for people to commit and invest in it, because it has to do with the control that you have over that financial commitment. Venture capitalists care a lot about control. For example, it's one of the things we fight the most about. Fight's the wrong word, but we work the most around when we're structuring deals. And I think the same goes for other kinds of investments. on the separation of currency and capital, that's a sensitive topic for me because I get really nervous when people propose designs that precisely separate currency and capital, where with good intentions, protocol designers or cryptoeconomic designers will try to create these two token systems, kind of trying to solve the same problem that led us to the setup that we have today, where some people are in capital and some people are in currency. It does help bring some scale and stability to the system, because it is true that people don't like volatility and things like that, and so a lot of well-intentioned designers say, okay, we'll put the governance and control and ownership token over here, and this is the other token number 2 that people can use to consume the service, or maybe use another token. So for example, some networks or systems will design themselves in such a way that there's the native kind of staking token or control token, but then you might use DAI or Ether or another token to actually consume the service, and they make it work that way. And that's fine, and that works, and it's not. I don't think it's inherently bad, but I get a little nervous because I think it may end up recreating the same dynamics that we have today, where within those systems, you would end up with a relatively small group of people who have all the control in the network, whereas all of the users don't have any of that. And that's okay, but it doesn't feel like an evolution from where we are today. Where at least my personal focus, as I mentioned before, is I want to spread capital as broadly as possible. And I don't think those designs do that. I think those designs end up concentrating capital the same way that the current capital instruments concentrate capital. On the other hand, if you have a system where the capital is also used to transact, you now introduce a different kind of dynamic where capital under the current instrument designs is actually incentivized to concentrate around itself. It's one of the reasons why we see concentration of capital increase over time, because when you don't have a reason to dispose of it, then you're not going to do so. And so what ends up happening is that less and less and less capital is available out there for people to acquire as it becomes more concentrated. Now, when you kind of mix the two back together and you kind of rebundle money, if we want to think about it that way, all of a sudden, if you own a piece of the system and the system grows in value as more people use it, but in order to use it, people have to have the capital in the system, then now your incentive is for more people to have it, so that more people can use it, so that the value of your investment can grow, as opposed to the current capital instruments where your incentive is for the system to grow, but for your ownership of the capital to increase. And so I think that by combining the functions, we get to design incentives that promote the distribution of capital rather than promote the concentration of capital. And promoting the distribution of capital has to do with that kind of feature where the only way for value to grow is for more people to have the capital. And this, by the way, also answers a question that you had earlier about some of the kind of paradoxes or things, unexpected things that we might find with crypto, and as it relates to value and value capture. And there is one thing that I don't think many people appreciate, which is that when value is more broadly distributed, there's actually more value in the absolute that is created. And so one thing that I think will catch people by surprise is how much new value we get to create by spreading value more broadly as opposed to concentrating.
I think that's a perfect place to full circle wrap our podcast. My guest today has been Joel Monegro. Joel, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. And for people who loved listening and want to go deeper, where might you point them? Obviously, there's the fantastic Placeholder blog and Twitter.
Yeah.
Any other plugs? Anything upcoming?
That's about it. We put everything on our blog at placeholder.vc, and it's key to what we do. Both Chris and I came from firms that were kind of founded on the basis of sharing your thoughts and insights and research. And so it's what we try to do on the Placeholder blog. So that would be the best way to stay on top of our latest thinking.
Fantastic. Joel, this has been a great episode. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you, Erik.
If you're an early stage entrepreneur, we'd love to hear from you. Please hit us up at villageglobal.vc/network catalyst.